significant was the billionaires' impact on the war effort? And as you alluded to before, to what extent did they utilize forced labor? How important was the forced labor to their businesses?
So to answer the first part, to answer your first question, they were incredibly important to the war effort because the Nazi regime relied on private industry, on private businesses, for the most part, to produce armaments, weapons, defense material for the Nazi war machine, and steel and natural resources. You know, there were a lot of kind of state initiative from the Nazi regime themselves, which were not, which were pretty badly run, and it was really, it was really, they needed private business to feed the Nazi war machine. And of course, once Nazi Germany makes the fateful decision to invade the Soviet Union, and all able-bodied men were called on to serve at the front, a massive labor shortage ensues. And as a result, Hitler initiates the largest coercive labor program that the world has ever seen to date, where, an estimated between 12 and 20 million Europeans end up being deported to be put to work in German factories and mines because of the labor shortages. And, roughly speaking, you had, there was a hierarchy in that, and in the lowest bottom of the rung were concentration camp captives, who, the SS made deals with companies, or the SS, which ran the concentration camps, made deals with large German companies, companies controlled by Günter Quandt and Friedrich Flick, for example, but also with Volkswagen, Siemens, BMW, Daimler-Benz, that they made deals with the US, with the SS, where they had concentration camps built, satellite concentration camps built on their factory complexes, and they would perversely lease the concentration camp captives from the SS, 6 Reichsmark per day for a skilled concentration camp inmate, 4 Reichsmark per day for unskilled concentration camp inmate. Of course, this money would never go to these captives. They were used as slaves, or as is famously described, less than slaves, because they were essentially annihilated through labor. And you would have these satellite concentration camps or sub-concentration camps on factory complexes. They were guarded by the SS. The companies that requested them were responsible for financing them, for having them built by the SS. The SS guarded them, also would guard then as an extra service the factory complexes themselves, and the factories themselves. And the concentration camp prisons were held there under the most horrific circumstances imaginable. No protective clothing. They would be beat at random. They would be executed through hanging or through being shot at random by the most minor infraction. There was no medical care. There was no adequate food. They had to sleep with 40, 50 people in barracks, etc., etc. And that was, an estimated, 1.5 million concentration camp captives would end up as slave laborers in German factories and mines. Then you had the prisoners of war, mostly Soviet prisoners of war who would be, which one who could request through the Wehrmacht, through the German army. They were also slaves. Of course, they fell under different set of rules because they technically fell under the Geneva Conventions. But they were also treated all as badly or almost as badly as concentration camp captives. And then thirdly, and that was the majority of forced laborers, were those that were rounded up in their German occupied countries and were deported from all over Europe to Germany, regardless of their religion, or or it was mainly, they were able-bodied men and women and teenagers that ended up being put to work. And they were forced in the sense that they didn't go voluntarily. And they would be paid, but they would be paid far less than what a German employee would get. And they would also be held in these so-called forced labor camps. And so those were roughly the three, so to say, categories of forced and slave labor.